Hello again and welcome to Phylum Echinodermata. This is our last lecture for invertebrates, guys. So reminder, you guys will have an invertebrates quiz if you haven't already taken it. You'll also have your test 2 coming up. So remember, test 2 is all the invertebrates. Not just the invertebrates, all the way back to algae, the microbes lecture, all of it. So make sure that you guys have been paying attention this whole time because there's a lot of information in this test number 2. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started with our very last phylum Echinodermata. Okay, so first off, phylum Echinodermata, as you can see right here, are pretty much your sea stars. Not just your sea stars, but all the sea stars are going to fall under phylum Echinodermata. Now, some of the other ones that you might not be super familiar with are sea urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, and sea lilies. Okay, so these are all known as the spiny skinned organism. So Echinodermata means spiny skin or hedgehog skin. So you can kind of think of anyone with like a really rough, bumpy texture. That's going to be under phylum Echinodermata for sure. So even these sea cucumbers are actually kind of squishy, but they still do have that bumpy skin. Even if you can squish them, they still have that bumpy, ridges in their skin, and therefore still falls under phylum Echinodermata. So let's go ahead and start with some characteristics. Some taxonomy before we get started with characteristics. Now, this is not super complicated taxonomy. This isn't like Mollusca or even Arthropoda where there's a ton going on. This is actually pretty straightforward and simple. So we have the class Asteroidia, or like asteroid, think stars, sea stars, right? Asteroidia, pretty simple. Next up is class Opheroidia. These are the brittle stars. So you look at a brittle star and you're like, that's a sea star. Notice I'm not saying starfish, it's sea star. You think of that and you're like, oh, that's a sea star. But a brittle star is different. A brittle star is very brittle and has a different body morphology than a true sea star. Just kind of like the jellies, the modified jellies and the true jellies that we already talked about. Same kind of thing here. So whereas Asteroidia are your actual sea stars, Opheroidia are the brittle stars. They're a little off, right? They're still sea stars, but they're a little off. That's how I always remembered it. Finally, we have the class Echinoidea. These are the sea urchins. And sand dollars. So these are these two guys right here. They are going to be covered in little tiny spines. And you're like, sand dollars aren't covered in spines. Yeah, they are when they're alive. Most of the time when you guys see sand dollar, you're seeing the the skeleton kind of thing. But all of the spines have been knocked off as it rolls around in the sand and the surf and stuff like that. Finally, we have the class Holothuroidea. These are your sea cucumbers. So this is kind of the group that's a little off from the rest of these guys. They all kind of look similar, except when you get to the actual sea cucumber, then he gets a little bit weird. But we're going to talk all about that, and we're going to see a cool video on a type of sea cucumber. All right, so characteristics. 1, these guys are radial, or what's called pentaradial, meaning they're radial, they're radiating out, but they're only radiating out in 5 directions, hence the penta. So pentaradial symmetry. The larvae, however, are bilateral. This is actually kind of a unique thing for these guys because they start out bilateral, but then they move and transition as they grow into an adult into that pentaradial symmetry. So they can be both. And you're like, wait a minute, how can you be both? Well, at different stages in your life, you can be both, right? So you start out as bilateral as a larvae, and then you end up pentaradial as an adult. Now, these guys do not have hearts, they don't have brains, they don't have eyes, they do not have a circulatory system, anything like we've seen before. So far we've had a closed circulatory system like us, and an open circulatory system like the mollusca and arthropoda that we talked about. This is a water vascular system. This guy is really cool. So he's a water vascular system. Our vascular system is our circulating fluids. So if you have a water vascular system, your circulating fluid is water. Okay, so essentially what they do is they allow water in. That's going to allow them to do that simple diffusion of the nutrients wherever they need to go, and the oxygen and the gases and stuff like that. But also it's kind of used as like a hydroskeleton. So what they do is they kind of, especially when it comes to some of these sea stars and the sea cucumbers for sure, they basically suck in water, and that's what kind of gives them their like structure. The water vascular system. So again, water vascular circulatory system right here. Their gills are actually located on their skin, which is pretty cool. So they can actually do that diffusion of oxygen just directly through their skin, which is pretty nice. Easy for them. They do have these little tentacle-like structures that come down. So I think this is my sea star right here. They have these like little tentacles on the bottom, right? They're actually used for movement. These are known as tube feet. Okay, so again, this is exactly how they move with this water system that they have, this hydroskeleton structure. What they do is they allow the water inside of them, and then they kind of push it in different directions inside these tube feet, which will allow the tube feet to stretch out and then retract them if they need to be. So it's really like interesting, and we're going to see a super cool video on how these guys actually move and how they hunt, because sea stars are badass. Let's see. They have a bunch of different predator avoidance techniques. So one of them you're kind of familiar with, just like a lizard's tail. They drop an arm, especially brittle stars. You look at a brittle star the wrong way and they just drop an arm and you're like, whoa, I didn't even do anything. And that's why they're called brittle stars, because they really are like to the touch, and then all their arms fall off and you're like, oh. Okay, so that's one thing. You can drop an arm and then let the predator either eat it or get distracted by it. Another thing that especially these sea cucumbers do is what's called gut evisceration, which is super fun. Essentially, they take their digestive system and they vomit it out at you. And they're like, here, eat this. And the predators are, one, too confused, and two, probably like, what is that smell? Yes, even in the water there is smell. And three, they're like, well, all right, that's edible. There's nutrients in it. I'm going to eat that. Okay, meanwhile, the sea cucumbers crawl away while the predator's scratching his head going, what the hell just happened? So yeah, gut evisceration, that's a fun one. Just vomit your guts at someone and be like, here, eat this. Weird. What else? I think I covered everything here. Oh, the tube feet. Again, it is how they move around. It is how they do their little walking around, but it's also how they hold on to stuff. So if you are, say, living in the intertidal zone and waves are constantly bashing you, right? You don't want to get knocked off your rock and potentially washed out to sea. You want to stay there. So those 2 feet are going to suck onto the rocks and hold on really, really tightly, allowing them a nice firm seal to that rock so that nobody can pry them off. Also, say you're a hungry sea star and you want to eat a mussel, right? What they're going to do is they're actually going to use your 2 feet to grab onto your shell and pry that shell open so they can get to you on the inside. So the 2 feet are used for locomotion, they're used for feeding, they're used for, predator avoidance, meaning holding onto that rocks. They're used for a variety of different things. All right, moving along, we have the first class that we're going to be talking about, the class Asteroidia. So these are, again, the sea stars, the true sea stars. These guys have 5 arms, obviously pentaradial, 5. Radiating outwards, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right here. This is his dorsal side, or the top side, and this is his ventral side, or the belly side. His mouth is located down here. We're going to talk about all that, and he's got these little ventral grooves, right, the ventral side. It's going to allow food to move all the way to his mouth. These guys have a madreporite, and that is this little guy right here. It's kind of hard to see, but on the dorsal side, the top side right here, it's almost going to look like a little button, like some kind of little, you can almost push it. That is the madreporite, and essentially what that is used for is allowing water to enter into your body, for your vascular system, for your hydrostatic skeleton. All of that kind of stuff is all done via this little madreporite. So if you ever see a little tiny dot on the dorsal side, the top side of that sea star, then you know it's got to be the madreporite. Oh, these guys are amazing hunters. So, super cool. I was telling you how they can basically take the mussel shells and they can pry them apart. Well, what they actually do after that is they take their stomach from inside their body, they take it outside of their body, they put it into the mussel shell, and they start secreting digestive enzymes that turns the mussel into liquid, and then they drink the mussel and then leave. Meanwhile, his shell is cracked maybe just a tiny little bit, but the mussel is completely dead now because the sea star ate him from the outside in. Like, just your stomach came up and out, and then you ate your food from the outside of your body. That's crazy. And yes, we are going to see a video on that because it's just fascinating. Let's see. Oh, another thing about sea stars. Sea stars are what's called keystone predators, meaning that they are very important to the ecosystem. You are keystone, like you are the foundation. And it's not because everybody's eating sea stars and that's what's really important, but no, the sea stars will actually control the community of the intertidal zone. And this is something that we're going to talk about when we actually get to the intertidal lecture. But they kind of regulate what's going on so that not one species really dominates. That is really good because now we have multiple species. And remember, we always want the most amount of species in an area because that's going to make our ecosystem more stable. What if one thing happens to one of them? Well, you got lots of other ones, so you probably still have food. If you only ate one type of food and that food disappeared, right, you're SOL. But if you have lots of different types of organisms living in the same area, most likely you can probably eat at least one of those other organisms, and therefore the community stays stable. So in the intertidal zone, when you remove the sea stars who eat the mussels actually outcompete everybody and take over the entire ecosystem. So instead of having limpets and barnacles and algae and anemones, you just have mussels. That's not healthy for the ecosystem. It's just a bunch of mussels. So again, that's why they are keystone predators. Very, very important predators. All right, looking at the morphology of these little sea stars, we have, again, this is the top side right here, the dorsal side. The madreporoid essentially is going to be located right here. We have the arms that are coming outwards, radiating out from the central area here. These are called arms. They are considered arms, which is why we have 5 arms. We do have these like sharp, bumpy little skin-like things. All the sea stars are different depending on the species, on how bumpy you're going to be. But again, Echinodermata, they're all bumpy. We have the bottom side with these little ventral grooves right here. I'm not going to ask you what the vocab word is. Just know that they're grooves on the bottom side. And this is essentially where the tube feet are going to be. And so the tube feet are out there. They're walking around. They're grabbing for food. At the tips of these guys, which you can't see right here, they actually have little sensors. And those are kind of the ones who are sniffing out the food. Those are like, they're like, where's the little food? Ooh. And usually they have one that's kind of modified into almost an eye. Remember, they don't have eyes. But they can kind of detect where they're going with the light and stuff like that, like we've seen in some of the other organisms. This guy right here, notice the pentaradial symmetry in these 2 adults. We have the larvae right here with bilateral symmetry. Okay, so you can only cut him right down the center and he's got 2 equal sides. That's what their larvae look like. Going on the inside, we have the madreporoid, the little bumpy, little button-looking thing on the very top side right here. This guy does open up and allow the water to come in through this little ring canal right here, feeding all of these little tube feet with water. And again, that's how they're actually going to be able to move, is just by pushing the water, increasing the pressure, and going to be stretching out that tube feet or retracting it, depending. Let's see, we have the digestive glands going along each of the canals right here. This is the radial canals here. We have the gonads are going to be these little green ones right here, also coming along each of these different arms. So essentially, each of these arms is like a complete digestive system, respiratory system, reproductive system in every single one of the arms. That's what's happening. So if we were actually in class, we would have been able to do a sea star dissection. I'm so very sorry that we can't. But again, you can still see the insides of these guys right here. And it really does kind of look exactly like this once you open them up. It's pretty cool. And this would be a single tube feet right here. And this is known as the ampullae, basically this little bumpy part, and then the podium, which comes down here. And that's what's going to push outwards, down and outwards here. And that's when you can actually see the little tube feet poking out right here. Oh, fun fact about these guys, because I got to give you some fun facts so that you guys actually remember this stuff. And I have no fun sex facts about these guys, but their anus is located on the top of their head, which means they poop on their own heads, making them shitheads. I know, I said an S word, but hopefully you guys remember that. So, yep, right? Anus is going to be right here, right on the top. Mouth is going to be located down below on the ventral side. And that's going to, again, where all these little ventral grooves and stuff, it's going to be able to push the food towards the mouth. They're going to digest it here in their little digestive glands, and then it's going to come up and out the top of their head. Yep, fun facts. Okay, let's take it on a more serious note, from pooping on our own heads to wasting away. So sea star wasting disease is actually a disease that was spread, I want to say it was like 8 or 10 years ago, something like that now. And it actually devastated the population of the sea stars. And this is really unfortunate. So what happened is they started just wasting away. So their big, hard structure, their rough it's not even exoskeleton, their rough skeletal system, their support system was always really rigid and hard. And if you poke a sea star, it's really hard and rough. But then all of a sudden they started kind of shriveling up and dying by the thousands. And we don't really know why. We're finally starting to get to this, bacterial viral infection that they had. But it was a disease that was spread from sea star to sea star. And when I was a kid, you could go to any intertidal zone, any pier, and you would always see sea stars. Now, you're lucky if you find one, maybe 2. If you 3, you're like, oh man, sea stars are doing great this year. Okay, but that's not the case. And that's because of this sea star wasting disease. So this is actually something that was really sad. And something that you can still see to this day. I took students out on a field trip last semester, and we were able to see a sea star that was wasting away. I wasn't sure if he was actually dead yet, or he was basically there though, but it was really sad. So here's a healthy sea star right here, nice and plump and you know, resilient. And then you can literally, they're wasting away. They're essentially shriveling up and dying. And so that's really super unfortunate for these sea stars because they're keystone predators. We need them. And now when you go to some of these intertidal zones, if you don't see any sea stars, all you see is mussels. No algae, no limpets, none of these other creatures that would be in the intertidal zone because we've lost our sea star predators. So on a more serious note, sea star wasting disease is kind of a big deal. And we lose these keystone predators. And so the whole ecosystem shifts and it's not good. All right, so let's take an example of that. Let's look at what happens if we lose the keystone predators. So here we see a rock of the intertidal zone. And this is very, very clearly characteristic of normal intertidal zones. We have some algae growing up on top. We have some mussels down below here. We've got some anemones going here. All of these are tiny little barnacles. They look like little specks, but they're actually barnacles. I'm sure we've got some limpets in there, maybe some chitons up top. Right? Healthy ecosystem. Look at how many different organisms are there. Nice, healthy, intertidal zone. And now we switch to a complete loss of sea stars, and what do you see? Just mussels, right? Just mussels. There's no barnacles. Here's a little bits of algae here, and that's it. There's nothing else. So all of these different communities and all of these different populations of these species are gone because we lose one. We lose the sea stars, we lose everybody else. Hence keystone species. Very important to the environment. So here's exactly why this is happening. So in the first part, we have a trophic, right? We have a food web, right? The trophic levels of what's going on here. Who's being eaten by who? And what you can see is the sea star is, and these arrows are going the wrong way. I don't know who drew this, but not me. And the arrows are going the wrong way. The arrows are probably supposed to go toward, remember, the mouth or where the energy's going. So let's just say this is a correct food web. And we can see that the sea stars are eating the mussels and the barnacles. And what else is this? And the chitons, right? They're all eating lots of different things, okay? Meanwhile, the chitons are also eating the algae. We've got nudibranchs, which are eating sponges. We've got all sorts of things that are kind of eating each other, right? Nice, healthy, balanced ecosystem. So now we remove the sea star, and now all we have is mussels, but nobody else was eating the mussels. So now the mussel population is just going to go crazy, right? We only have a couple small limpets that are maybe eating barnacles or some kind of algae, but really that healthy, balanced ecosystem that we have here kind of gets altered because we just lost the main predator. And usually what happens is that main predator keeps one of its prey in check. So the mussels were kept in check because the sea stars continue to eat them. As soon as you remove them, the mussels are like, well, then we're going to grow and reproduce like crazy, and then we're going to wipe everybody else out. We're going to out-compete them. And now we're the only ones who are able to actually survive and remain in the intertidal zone. All right, let's move on to the class Opheroidia. So we're done with Asteroidia. Now we're going to be talking about Opheroidia. So these are the brittle stars. So even though they have the 5 arms that are radiating outwards, they're radiating outwards from not a central body, but a central disc. So we have a single disc that actually contains their reproductive organs, their digestive system. So in fact, it's the opposite of the sea stars, meaning each arm doesn't have everything. Each arm has nothing, technically. Really, all that's, that makes up the sea star is going to be in the actual central disc. So it's not going to be anywhere else. It's not going to be in the arms, which is why they can so readily drop their arms if they need to. So it's okay for them to lose an arm every once in a while because that's okay. Their respiratory system, reproductive system, digestive system, it's all in that central disc. So as long as their central disc remains intact and they have at least one arm so we can actually go out and grab food, then they'll be okay. They'll be able to regenerate the rest of those arms. Now, under the class Opheroidia, we actually have 2 different groups. We have the brittle stars that I've been talking about, but we also have these really cool ones called Basketstars. Now, they still have that centralized disc with all the arms radiating outwards, but they don't have 5 arms. They got lots of arms. And in fact, those arms have arms, and those arms have arms, and those arms have arms. There's just all this series of branching of their little tiny arms, and that's what you can see right here. So it almost looks like a woven basket because there are just so many arms. And they're all kind of connected and branching off each other and moving around. Oh, and they all move really creepily too because they all can kind of move by themselves. These guys are typically deeper water species. They are going to be feeding on plankton, so usually they kind of sit with all their arms up and they just kind of go like this and they wait for little plankton to come by and then they... Fun fact, there was a video that went viral not too many years ago of some alien species found in the depths of the ocean. Yeah, no, it was just a brittle star. So all the marine biologists were like, dude, that's just a brittle star. But it's because the arms were like moving and they're curling and they're just doing this like weird little. So it was actually, to anyone who didn't know what a brittle star looks like, you'd be like, what the hell is that? And it's all crazy and weird, but really it was just a brittle star. Let's see. Sorry, a Basketstar. Basketstar, brittle star. Basketstar, brittle star. So the brittle stars are scavengers. And the brittle stars are also going to be deep sea because remember, your morphology kind of determines where you're able to survive. These guys have really brittle arms. Can you imagine one of them in the intertidal zone? One wave would hit and all their arms would be gone. And they're like, well, now I'm starving to death. Not going to be good. So they live in the deep sea. They're basically crawling around the sandy bottom of the ocean looking for food. So once they find either, some decaying material or maybe even detritus that's sitting there and, they're eating it off the sand, whatever, that's where they find food because they're going to be finding it as scavengers. They do have 5 very thin arms, hence the brittle parts. That's this guy right here. And a lot of them do have sensory receptors at the end of them, kind of like the sea stars that we were talking about that can kind of sense, right? They're looking around, they're smelling. They don't have noses. How else can they smell? With their little chemoreceptors that are going to be found in some of their tube feet. What else? Okay, here's the body morphology of a brittle star. You can see the central disc right here. This is where all the important goodies are. And the 5 arms that are radiating outwards. The mouth is here, and they do have these little teeth that are used for the little crushing and the breaking up of. So very simple body morphology when it comes to brittle stars. Here's a couple of classic examples of brittle stars and basket stars. So we have a bunch of different brittle stars on this side. You can see central disc and very, very thin, tiny arms coming outwards. And then we have a couple different examples of the basket stars. And you can see why they're called basket stars because they kind of look like weird little baskets with all these crazy little curly Q arms. So pretty cool, these guys. Moving to the class Echinoderms, these are your sea urchins and your sand dollars. So again, they're going to have that pentaradial symmetry, even though it doesn't kind of look like it. They've got their little tube feet, how they're moving around, and they also have spines. So this is where we actually have legit spines. Now the urchins and the sand dollars both have spines. The sand dollar spines are not nearly as strong and as big as the sea urchin spines. Sea urchin spines are also serrated. So if you don't know what that means, it basically means that there's little spikes on the outside. So if you go one way, you don't get them, but if you go the other, you're just shredded. And that's what makes getting stabbed by these sea urchin spines so very painful, because it literally just goes in your skin and you can't pull it out. It just goes in and then just stuck there and just starts shredding your inside. Oh, it's actually like the number 1 diver injury is sea urchins. So when everyone's like, oh, diving's so scary, and what about all the sharks? Really? You know what you have to worry about? Getting poked by one of these little guys. Yeah, painful. And some of them do have venom, so some of them will actually start to burn you as you just got stabbed and it's burning. My dad stepped on an urchin once. He was screaming like a little girl. It was actually pretty funny, except, I couldn't do anything about it because I couldn't pull it out. Serrated. What are you going to do? Eventually it calcified over and then his body just, got rid of it. But it stayed in there and yeah, it hurt. Let's see. Their little globular bodies are inside a kind of shell-like thing, which is, I do say shell-like because it's not, known as a test. So you can find urchin tests. They basically look like round little balls with little bumps on them. In fact, I think I have one to show you guys. Okay, so this right here is a sea urchin test, and what you can see, there's all those little tiny bumps. Each one of those bumps would have had a spine. Now, if you look very closely, and I don't think you can see it here, but there are tiny little holes on the bottom side. Those tiny little holes are actually where the tube feet are going to come out of. Okay, so this guy's obviously been eaten by somebody. His holes down here are not that big, and neither are the ones on the top. Yes, his anus is still going to be on the top side, and yes, his mouth is still going to be on the bottom side. These guys do have a really cool mouth. Actually, it's called an Aristotle's lantern. Why it's called an Aristotle's lantern, I don't know. And if you can find that out, I'd love to find out because that sounds like an interesting story. But essentially, it's like these 5 little plates that are kind of almost like creating a beak. And that's what they do is they kind of bite the algae and they rip the algae off and then they eat the algae. So these guys are predators of algae. And you're like, how can you be a predator of an algae? You can, because what these guys do is they will actually go and they will eat the entire kelp forest. So they're eating the bottom, the holdfast, that detaches the kelp then floats away and can't do anything and dies. And there's no kelp left because these guys actually eat so much sometimes they create what's called urchin barrens. And urchin barrens are actually a really big deal because remember, we talked about macrocystis, the giant algae that's so important to our ecosystem off our coast. If you lose all that, you lose everything else. So in this case, the urchins are one of those keystone predators. But really, it's not the urchins that's the keystone predator. It's the guy who keeps the urchins in check. So remember, the Cstar was the keystone predator who kept the barnacles in check. The barnacles are the one who messed everything up. Okay, same kind of thing here. But in this case, the urchins are the ones who are messing everything up, and it's their predators that are the keystone predators. In that case, it is otters. Okay? Otters are predators of the sea urchins. Not a lot of guys can eat these sea urchins. Sheephead fish can do so. Urchins can do so. Sorry, urchins can do so. Otters can do so, but not a ton of other guys can eat these urchins. So what we need to do is we need to maintain the urchin populations low so they don't take over and start eating all of our kelp forests. So unfortunately, in the early 1900s and before, people really like furs, and otters have the thickest, softest fur. We're going to talk about that when we get to mammals. But it's so, and obviously people wanted that, and so they started killing all of the otters for their fur. When we killed all the otters, the urchins were like, hey, nobody's left to eat me. We're going to reproduce like crazy, just like the mussels did. And then they take over the ecosystem, and boom, now we lost our kelp forest, which means we lost all the fish there, the invertebrates there, the birds, the algae, everything that we had in that ecosystem is now gone because of these little urchins. So there's companies like the Santa Monica Baykeepers. They actually go out and collect urchins, smash them, and then dump them overboard. Well, I think sometimes they don't even smash them because we're men. Again, if you're releasing all of those gametes, then you're going to get huge blooms. What they do is they collect them, and they just chuck them overboard in like some deep part of the ocean where they're going to sink down, where there is no algae, which means no food, and they're going to die. Now you're like, that's so barbaric. They're urchins. There's a ton of them. They don't have brains or feelings or eyes. They don't know what's happening to them. And their nutrients are going to be recycled. Someone down below is going to still eat them, so all of that nutrients are still going to be recycled. It's better than like collecting them and throwing them in the trash or something, you know. Yeah, okay. Oh, their spines are fun. Their spines can move in all sorts of different directions and independent of each other. That is how they move around with their little tube feet in their spines. They're kind of poking around, feeling around for stuff. Fun fact, it is really hard to track these guys. There's a thing called mark and recapture in ecology. So, like, say you're trying to keep track of this particular sea urchin, and there's so many of them. Like, you're not going to name him Bob. They look exactly alike. You can't distinguish him. So I know a scientist who was actually trying to do studies on him, and they would like try to like put something on him, and then they'd like knock him off with their little spines, and then they'd try to like put a rubber band around him so they couldn't, and then they'd like wiggle their spines and get the rubber band off. So yeah, they're actually pretty hard to track and mark and recapture, which is cool. The class Echinoidea, moving right along to the we're in the class Echinoidea. What am I talking about? Moving along to the sand dollars in Echinoidea, the other Echinoidea, not the sea urchin, but the sand dollar. This little guy right here, I notice his color is purple, just like the other ones we saw. Those purple urchins are very common off our coast. Those are Strongylocentus purpuratus, which is super fun to say. These guys are the sand dollars, probably Dendrast or something. And these guys are usually found in what's called sand dollar beds. And that's what you can see right here. And there are thousands of sand dollars here. And they kind of get together and they live in these like sandy areas. And then what they do is they kind of make their spines move and then they stand up. Because what they're doing with their spines is they're trying to actually suspension feed. They're trying to get some of that, phytoplankton out of the water. And so what they'll do is they'll catch it with their little tiny spines and then they'll move it towards their mouth, and which is actually pretty cool. When the waves get too high and it gets a little bit too rough, what they do is they go from this vertical position and they just lay down flat. Sometimes they get buried, but they can just dig themselves right out. And that's usually what you see, like this guy right here. It's kind of sitting more flat and on the bottom. Now, like I already mentioned, those spines do get knocked off when they die, and their test does kind of roll around and then bleaches in the sun usually, and then turns into that nice white pretty sand dollar that you guys I'm sure have found on the beach at some point in your lives. What else? Oh, these beds again these are called beds. These are called sand dollar beds. I was diving in La Jolla, and they have the biggest bed I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, there was probably millions of these sand dollars just kind of kicking it, and they're all just standing upright, and they're just sitting there just doing the little suspension feeding. What a sight to see. Seriously, what a sight to see. So looking at that pentaradial symmetry right here, this is a sea biscuit. It's a type of sand dollar. You can definitely tell it's pentaradial symmetry right here. Sand dollar again right here. This is the ventral side of the sand dollar, so his mouth will be located right here. And these little fuzzy spines again, just going to help that food move to the center. Sea urchins come in a variety of different sizes and shapes as well, and so do their spines. Sometimes they're very, very long and skinny. Sometimes they're short and fat. Sometimes they're all different sorts of colors, and it's actually pretty cool, the variety. Looking inside a sea urchin, we have the spines on the outside. We have that madrepore. Remember, they're letting that water in. Anus is located on top. Mouth is located on the bottom. The mouth, this is that Aristotle's lantern right here. These 5 little calcareous plates. And again, they're used to kind of just grab and just bite and just tear off these little tiny pieces of algae. Again, these are different types of spines right here. This doesn't look like a sea urchin because you're like, those aren't sharp spiny. They're not always have to be. They don't always have to be. English. Okay, so these are just big, kind of almost looks like breadstick spines that this little guy has. So it definitely, it's a variety of different body morphologies, but all that pentaradial symmetry, spines radiating outwards, Aristotle's lantern, all of those are definitely the same. Here are a couple different examples of urchin barrens. So on this picture right here, we can see a big, healthy, beautiful kelp forest. We see all these 3D environments. It's a vertical habitats, lots of places to live. This is a similar area with an urchin barren. An urchin barren essentially, or what's called an urchin front, is all the urchins have, their population has boomed, and what they do is they kind of all march together and they kill every piece of algae that they come across because they're starving. So they're starving and they're looking for algae and they're looking for algae, and then they eat the whole fast, boom, the rest of the kelp forest gone. Now it's an urchin barren. Now they move on to the next location. Okay, again, right here, I think this is the same exact area or close to it. This is off of Anacapa here. And you can see nice, healthy ecosystem, good kelp forest, yay, we love it. And urchin barren. I mean, you can just see the difference. There's nothing here, there's nothing here. You can't even tell how much is here because there's so many places to hide, and that's what organisms need. So remember that rugosity, that complexity that I've been talking about so many times. Very, very important, which the algae provides, which the urchins then take away. Finally, the last class, the class Opheroidia. These guys are the sea cucumbers. These guys do have a leathery type of skin, not as hard as, say, the urchins or the sea stars that we've been talking about so far. Still covered in the bumps, is very clearly represented right here by this little sea cucumber. They are called sea cucumbers because they are about the size and the length of an actual cucumber. And when you see them, you just kind of look like, hey, what's that like a little stick just laying out? Because they just kind of, look like this. Not to be mistaken with giant worms, right? These sea cucumber are Echinoderms, so they are the spiny-skinned organisms. They do have that water vascular system, but they don't have tube feet that they're necessarily using to walk with. They do have these modified tube feet in the front. Basically, there's kind of like these like feeding tentacles, and that's basically what they're doing is they're kind of going around and they're doing deposit feeding. So the things that have been deposited on the bottom of the seafloor, they kind of go along and they eat, and then they eat the sand, keep the organics, poop out the rest, eat the sand, eat the sand, eat the sand. It is theorized that every single piece of sand in the world at some point has passed through the digestive system of a sea cucumber. And you're like, wait a minute, when I'm walking barefoot on the sand, that is actually poop of a sea cucumber? Probably. I know. Crazy things to learn about the ocean and the environment. But you're like, that's gross. It's actually not, because what they're doing is they're removing all the organics and they're just releasing out the sand. So they're cleaning as they go. So as they eat, these guys are actually cleaning the bottom of the seafloor. So super, super important for healthy ecosystems to have these sea cucumbers around. I think that's it. Here's a couple different body morphologies of the sea cucumbers. Lots of different varieties and shapes, and some gut eviscerations. So again, this is where they're actually going to take their guts and it out, so that's their defensive mechanism. And wouldn't you be distracted if something like this happened? I'd be like, I have no idea what's going on, and I don't really want to eat you anymore. That's really their only defense mechanism, because they don't have that, sharp spines or hard skeletal structure like the sea stars do. Taking a look at the inside, we have the mouth right here. We basically have these little feeding tentacles, which are on the outside right here. We've got the digestive system here. We've got some reproductive system on the outside here. All sorts of different things going on here. No, I'm not going to ask you to know this, but again, this is very important if you're trying to look at the body morphology, especially the internal anatomy of these guys, and want to provide that for you. We already talked about the evisceration, the gut evisceration, the vomiting up of their internal organs. This does allow them to escape. The predators do get confused, or at least provided some kind of food with zero effort. So they can just eat those digestive systems and get the nutrients that they need, while meanwhile the sea cucumber has crawled away. Fun fact about these guys is sometimes they have a symbiotic relationship with what's called a pearlfish. And the pearlfish actually lives inside the anus of a sea cucumber. Yes. And you're like, how is that benefiting? Well, remember, this is symbiont, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a good symbiont. The pearlfish, meanwhile, gets a house and gets some food if he needs while, and the sea cucumber gets a pearlfish living in its butt. Win-win. This is a sea cucumber right here. This is a big chonky boy. And this is the pearlfish, which has this larger head area right here and this long, skinny, kind of almost like eel-like tail and body. And that's what he backs into the back end of the sea cucumber with. And you can see a different species of pearlfish and a different species of sea cucumber right here with the head poking out of the anal region of the sea cucumber. Fun, crazy marine biologist facts, right? You're going to be like, guys, there is a fish that lives in a sea cucumber's butt. And you're like, yeah, yes, there is. It's called a pearlfish. In fact, let's watch a video on it. Aren't you glad that you learned about pearlfish? I know, you're now like, I now have that permanently ingrained in my brain that there is something called a pearlfish that exists inside of a sea cucumber. So hopefully you guys like that, and the cute little sea pig. I love those true facts videos. Hopefully you guys are enjoying them as much as I am. Also, if you guys want to check out the shape of life on Echinodermata, it's a really great one. In fact, I'm going to probably put that up on the Canvas site for you guys because it really shows you how the 3D body morphology, how it really is pentaradial. And you're like, that sea star looks nothing like the sea cucumber. But when you watch the video, it actually shows you if you were to take them and kind of curl them up and turn them into a sea urchin and then stretch them out and turn them into sea cucumber. So definitely watch that shape of life on Echinoderms video. It's really, really cool. And with that said, it's coming out of the, anyway. If you guys have any questions, make sure to email me. Again, you have your test coming up. Don't cram. You guys have to study and put the time in for this, especially when it comes to the taxonomy and stuff. You guys will have a lab test on all of this. It's gonna be a lot of stuff. So remember, your written exams are more kind of like characteristics and why are they different, and then the lab exams are gonna be more like taxonomy wise. So it's gonna be a little bit of both in both tests, but really they're gonna focus on individual things. So make sure you guys are studying for that. I hope you guys have enjoyed all my invertebrate lectures, and I will see you guys after your test for vertebrates, because we're going to get into real cool stuff now. Things like mammals and birds and reptiles, and you guys are going to love it. So let's go ahead and get started with that as soon as we're done with invertebrates. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me, and I'll see you soon.